Here is a bitter, uncomfortable psychological truth that most people will aggressively deny when you get furiously angry at someone. It is almost never about justice, as it is almost always about your own fragile ego. Think about the last time someone wronged you in a completely ordinary situation. Maybe a guy in a massive 3-ton pickup truck suddenly cut you off while you were driving down the interstate at 70 miles per hour. Or a coworker casually gossiped about you during a critical morning meeting. Or a close friend broke a promise they made weeks ago. Instantly, your blood boils, your heart rate spikes, and your muscles tense up because the ego desperately wants to feel superior. So it immediately builds a highly compelling, cinematic story in your head. In this fabricated narrative, you are the innocent, flawless victim fighting for what is right, and the other person is the evil, toxic villain who intentionally set out to ruin your day. You completely convince yourself that your raging response is entirely justified. But ancient Stoicism and modern psychology completely dismantle this comfortable, self-serving illusion. Modern psychology calls this the projection bias, which is the deeply ingrained human tendency to drastically exaggerate the faults of others while completely minimizing or entirely ignoring our own. Notice how breathtakingly hypocritical we all are in our daily lives when we tell a little white lie, lose our patience with a barista over a simple 16-ounce cup of coffee, or accidentally hurt someone's feelings because we quietly look the other way and rationalize it. We immediately whisper excuses to ourselves, saying things like we did not really mean to do it, we meant well, or it was just a rare exception because we were exhausted after a grueling 10-hour shift. We grant ourselves an infinite amount of grace and understanding, but the moment someone else makes the exact same mistake, we react violently, pointing our fingers squarely in their face and judging them with ruthless severity. We use our towering anger to look down on them and artificially elevate ourselves, becoming pathetic puppets completely manipulated by our own unexamined emotions. We willingly trade the quiet, unshakable power of a calmly observant mind for the chaotic, exhausting performance of self-righteous indignation. This is where the profound, 2,000-year-old wisdom of the Stoics steps in to deliver a much-needed wake-up call, demanding that you step back and adopt the perspective of the observer. Marcus Aurelius, the great Stoic emperor who ruled over the entire known world and faced catastrophic betrayals that would utterly break an ordinary person, urged us to look inward before ever daring to condemn others. He knew that it is remarkably easy to see the glaring flaws in others, but we conveniently forget that we too have been impatient, jealous, and careless. The brilliant philosopher Epictetus taught a profound lesson that cuts straight to the core of our modern outrage culture, stating that when you are offended by the faults of others, you should look at yourself and consider your own faults, and then you will forget your anger. Before you allow the violent tempest of rage to explode the next time you feel slighted, you must pause and ask yourself a brutal, unforgiving question: are you really fighting against a cosmic injustice? Or are you just upset because your precious pride got bruised? Stoicism teaches a radical form of humility, forcing you to use each daily irritation, every rude driver on the freeway, and every passive-aggressive email in your inbox as a psychological mirror, not a weapon. You have to realize that every time you surrender to blind anger, you are willingly handing over the keys to your mind to the exact person you are angry with, letting someone who does not even care about you live rent-free in your head, dictating your blood pressure and stealing your precious focus. True power does not lie in how loudly you can shout or how fiercely you can retaliate when the world does not perfectly meet your expectations. Instead, true power lies in the untouchable tranquility of a mind that simply refuses to be disturbed by the chaotic noise, acting as a silent, unmovable observer watching a furious storm from the absolute safety of a distant mountaintop. Always remember this uncomfortable, ultimate truth. The next time you feel the intense heat rising in your chest, self-righteous anger is just disguised pride. If you strip away the comforting lies we tell ourselves and look at anger with absolute, unflinching honesty, you will realize that it is not a protective shield. It is not a righteous weapon of justice, and it is certainly not a genuine sign of strength. Instead, it is a highly contagious, deeply destructive psychological illness. We live in a modern culture that constantly encourages us to vent our daily frustrations, falsely promising that aggressively letting out our rage will somehow make us feel completely liberated and powerful. But when you give in to that explosive, unchecked impulse, you are not purging the poison from your system. You are willingly drinking it and desperately hoping the other person suffers the consequences. The brilliant Roman philosopher Seneca, who spent a massive portion of his life studying the devastating mechanics of human rage, diagnosed this powerful emotion not as a natural, healthy response, but as a short-lived, terrifying madness. Think about how anger fundamentally operates in your everyday life like a virulent, airborne pathogen. Seneca observed over 2,000 years ago that anger is a remarkably bad habit that is incredibly transmissible, spreading effortlessly from parents to their young children, from a highly stressed corporate manager to an entire department of exhausted employees, and from a reckless, speeding driver on the highway straight into your own peaceful living room. If you spend enough of your precious time around chronically furious, bitter people, their toxic mindset will inevitably infect your own, dragging you down into their exhausting, pessimistic reality where everything is perceived as a personal attack. When you become deeply infected by this temporary madness, your brain genuinely believes it is building a towering, impenetrable fortress to protect your fragile ego from the perceived injustices of the outside world. However, Seneca offered what is perhaps the most profound and terrifying visual metaphor for anger in human history, stating that the angry person is exactly like a massive, collapsing building that is reduced to rubble, even as it ruthlessly crushes everything it falls upon. When you completely lose your temper and unleash a violent storm of fury upon your spouse, your children, or your closest friends, you might briefly feel like a powerful, righteous conqueror in the blinding heat of the moment. But the brutal, unavoidable reality is that you are just a crumbling skyscraper of raw, unexamined emotion, completely destroying your own foundation, ruining your own hard-earned reputation, and mercilessly crushing the people who actually care about you under the heavy, suffocating weight of your wounded pride. You have to understand that anger differs drastically from all of the other ordinary human vices because while other personal flaws might simply push your mind in the wrong direction, anger completely overthrows your mind. It violently stages a psychological coup, takes the rational, logical part of your brain hostage, and burns the entire internal system to the ground until nothing remains but regret. This catastrophic loss of control brings us to the most humiliating aspect of surrendering to your blinding rage, which is the undeniable fact that it permanently strips you of your personal autonomy and turns you into a pathetic, helpless puppet. Every single time you allow a completely external event to dictate your internal emotional state, you are voluntarily handing over the strings that control your life to random strangers and highly unpredictable circumstances. If a significantly delayed flight at the airport makes you shout aggressively at a helpless customer service agent, the massive airline corporation is actively pulling your strings. If a sarcastic, passive-aggressive comment from a jealous coworker ruins your entire week and keeps you awake at night staring blankly at the bedroom ceiling, that coworker is directly pulling your strings. You mistakenly believe that you're loud, aggressive. Confrontational reactions are a formidable display of dominance and unbreakable boundaries, but in stark reality, you are just dancing perfectly on cue for anyone who knows exactly how to push your emotional buttons. A true Stoic philosopher looks at this highly reactive, exhausted lifestyle and sees it as the ultimate form of self-imposed slavery. Why would you ever allow your precious, hard-won peace of mind to be so easily disrupted by chaotic things that are completely outside of your control? by constantly reacting to the endless noise of the modern world. You absolutely guarantee that you will never experience the profound, unshakable power of true tranquility, completely missing the fact that you possess the ultimate ability to simply step out of the furious storm and permanently cut those strings. So how do we permanently cut these invisible strings that turn us into helpless puppets dancing for the amusement of a chaotic world, and finally cure this devastating psychological illness? To find the ultimate remedy, we must look backward across 2,000 years of human history to uncover a profound secret utilized by the most powerful men in the ancient world. Imagine the daily life of Marcus Aurelius, the legendary Roman emperor who single-handedly ruled over the entire known world. If anyone in human history had the ultimate, undeniable justification to completely lose their temper and unleash towering rage, it was him. He faced unimaginable stress every single day, leading massive armies through freezing, muddy frontiers to defend his borders, dealing with catastrophic plagues that wiped out millions of his citizens, and suffering through agonizing, heartbreaking betrayals from his closest political allies and even his own family members. By our modern standards, he should have been a chronically furious, emotionally exhausted wreck, constantly lashing out at his servants and subordinates out of sheer frustration. Yet, he is universally remembered not for his towering rage, but for his absolute, unshakable tranquility. He mastered a highly coveted state of psychological invincibility that we can accurately call peak calmness. How exactly did a man carrying the crushing, unimaginable weight of a global empire avoid becoming the collapsing building that Seneca warned us about? He did not achieve this by artificially suppressing his feelings, swallowing his pride, or foolishly pretending that the betrayals did not hurt. Instead, he utilized a highly sophisticated, rigorously tested psychological weapon that completely neutralized the destructive power of anger before it could even take root in his mind. This extraordinary weapon is an ancient practice known as mental distancing. Mental distancing is not some passive, weak form of surrender to the universe, but rather a supreme display of internal dominance and unyielding self-control. It is the deliberate, conscious act of creating a massive psychological buffer zone between an external triggering event and your own internal response. When an ordinary, untrained person is insulted or wronged, the space between the event and their reaction is absolute zero. They are immediately consumed by the fire, blindly reacting to the provocation like a trapped animal. But the master of mental distancing artificially expands that space. They recognize that their emotions are not objective reality, but merely subjective impressions trying to sell them a false, highly exaggerated narrative. Imagine your mind as a vast, incredibly deep ocean. On the very surface, terrifying storms constantly rage. Massive hurricane winds howl relentlessly and aggressive. 80-foot waves crash violently against each other. This chaotic surface represents the external world of terrible drivers cutting you off, rude coworkers gossiping behind your back, and endless daily frustrations. However, if you dive just a few hundred feet below that violent surface, the water is perfectly still, completely silent, and totally undisturbed by the chaos raging above. Mental distancing is the tactical ability to instantly plunge into those quiet, untouchable depths the exact moment the world attempts to drag you into its surface-level drama. Marcus Aurelius left behind a brilliant blueprint for this technique in his private journals, boldly declaring that you have power over your mind, not outside events, and that realizing this will give you profound strength. This is not just a poetic piece of motivation. It is a ruthless, pragmatic strategy for reclaiming your stolen autonomy. When you actively practice mental distancing, you stop viewing other people's toxic behavior as a direct assault on your soul, and instead, you start viewing it as mere weather. You would never scream at a rainstorm for ruining your expensive leather shoes, because you know the rain does not care about you. It is simply doing what rain does. In the exact same way, a truly stoic mind looks at an angry, insulting, or disrespectful person and completely refuses to take their behavior personally. By stepping back and observing the situation from a vast psychological distance, you strip the offending person of all their perceived power to hurt you. You look at their raging insults the same way you would look at a dark cloud passing harmlessly overhead. You simply observe it, refuse to let it dictate your internal weather, and remain firmly anchored in your own state of peak calmness. To understand exactly how this profound psychological transition works in the heat of the moment, you must learn to master the core mechanism of mental distancing, which ancient philosophers referred to as invoking the observer's self. Imagine that you are hiking high up in the Rocky Mountains and you suddenly see a massive, violent thunderstorm rolling through the deep valley thousands of feet below your current position. You can easily see the blinding flashes of lightning. You can hear the deafening roar of the thunder, and you can watch the torrential rain completely flood the forest floor. But you are completely safe because you are standing high above it all on a sunlit, untouched peak. You are merely watching the dangerous storm happen, but you are not actually inside the storm. This is the exact psychological state you must consciously engineer the next time someone fiercely insults you or a highly stressful situation threatens to ruin your day. The key element in this ancient practice is creating a completely detached perspective from which you can evaluate your own thoughts and chaotic emotions without any bias or personal attachment. When you feel the intense, burning sensation of anger bubbling up in your chest during a tense corporate meeting or while sitting in gridlock traffic on a 10-lane interstate, your immediate, unconditioned instinct is to completely merge with that powerful emotion. Your fragile ego desperately wants you to become the anger, to let it pilot your physical body, and to dictate every single word that comes out of your mouth. But the exact moment you feel that aggressive surge, you must aggressively hit the psychological pause button and force your mind to step outside of your body, effectively splitting your consciousness into two distinct entities, the part of you that is experiencing the biological reaction, and the observer self who is calmly watching the reaction unfold. When anger threatens to violently erupt, turning to this detached observer viewpoint allows you to objectively assess your emotional state instead of being blindly enslaved by it. You look at your own rage as if it were a fascinating scientific specimen placed under a microscope, or a temporary, passing cloud in the sky. You say to yourself that you are currently experiencing the biological sensation of anger. Your heart rate is highly elevated, and your ego feels slightly threatened, but this intense emotion is fundamentally not who you are. By actively objectifying your own anger through this powerful observer's perspective, you instantly enhance your control over it, acting like the calm, untouchable center in the middle of a swirling hurricane. You suddenly realize that the emotion itself is entirely transitory, highly mutable, and completely subject to your ultimate control. Crucial in this mental arsenal is the conscious decision to permanently shift from a purely reactive deficit to a highly proactive response. The reactive individual becomes a pathetic puppet to external circumstances, allowing outside conditions to dictate their sentiments and completely drain their energy. They loudly moan about daily adversities, immediately blame others for their negative feelings, and display explosive anger because they possess absolutely zero internal boundaries. However, when you successfully adopt the observer self, you instantly replace this chaotic reactivity with a mindful, deliberate, and proactive response. By choosing a proactive response, you assume total control over your internal state, acting firmly within your own sphere of influence rather than being helplessly dragged around by outside events. The brilliant Stoic philosopher Epictetus perfectly summarized this life-changing mechanism when he stated that it is not things themselves that disturb people, but their deeply flawed judgments about those things. Your anger does not come directly from the person who rudely cut you off, or the colleague who completely undermined your hard work. The anger comes exclusively from your internal judgment that you have been unfairly disrespected and that you must immediately retaliate to protect your precious pride. As Seneca wisely noted, our terrifying perturbations and furious reactions come directly from the subjective opinion which resides entirely within our own minds. The observer's self does not frantically attempt to repress, ignore, or artificially suffocate the emotion, because that would just create a dangerous psychological pressure cooker waiting to inevitably explode. Instead, the Stoic observer simply watches the anger rise, refuses to grant it the required permission to take over the steering wheel, and calmly waits for it to naturally dissipate. By deliberately choosing to stand on that towering mountain peak and looking down at your own internal chaos, you reclaim your absolute sovereignty and realize that no external event has the power to disturb your peace. Now that you thoroughly understand the profound necessity of stepping outside of your blinding emotions and actively invoking the observer's self, you must equip yourself with the exact tactical toolkit required to execute this flawless psychological maneuver in the chaotic heat of the moment. We are not dealing with vague philosophical theories here. We are dealing with highly practical, rigorously tested battle strategies designed to completely neutralize your raging ego before it successfully sabotages your life. The absolute first weapon you must deploy in your newly acquired arsenal is the supreme power of calculated delay. Over 2,000 years ago, before the legendary Roman leader Augustus officially became the most powerful emperor on the face of the earth, he was continuously tutored and heavily mentored by a brilliant Stoic philosopher named Athenodorus. When this wise philosopher was finally preparing to permanently retire from the emperor's royal service, he gave Augustus one final, legendary piece of advice that you must permanently burn into your memory. He looked directly at the most powerful man in the world and told him that whenever he felt intensely angry, he must passionately promise to never say a single word or take any action before silently repeating the entire 24 letters of the ancient alphabet to himself. This might sound incredibly simplistic, almost like childish advice, but it is actually a profoundly devastating psychological weapon against the temporary madness of rage. The absolute surest cure for explosive anger is always a forced delay, because it aggressively forces open that critical, life-saving psychological buffer zone we discussed earlier. When your fragile ego screams at you to immediately lash out at a rude customer service representative or an aggressive driver on the crowded interstate, repeating the alphabet or simply forcing yourself to take 10 incredibly deep breaths artificially completely paralyzes your biological impulse to strike back. During those crucial seconds of delay, the violent storm of your initial biological reaction begins to rapidly lose its destructive momentum, giving your logical, rational mind the exact amount of precious time it desperately needs to permanently reject the passionate, unhinged emotional impression that is trying to hijack your brain. Once you have successfully deployed the powerful weapon of delay and stabilized your internal weather, you must immediately strike with the second, ultimate weapon in your tactical toolkit, which ancient philosophers called the strict dichotomy of control. As you are standing safely on your mental mountain peak, looking far down at the rising heat of your own frustration, you must ruthlessly ask yourself one highly specific, utterly unforgiving question: is the thing that is currently making me so furiously angry actually located within my absolute, undeniable sphere of influence? The brilliant philosopher Epictetus laid down this absolute law when he firmly declared that there are certain things which are fully within our power, and there are countless other things which are completely beyond our power. Your own personal comportment, your internal attitudes, your deliberate choices, and your conscious reactions are the only things that truly belong inside your sphere of influence. Absolutely everything else, including the terrible weather, the fluctuating stock market, the massive delays at the crowded airport, and most importantly, The highly toxic, disrespectful, and completely irrational behavior of other people exists entirely in the external domain that is 100% beyond your power. The bitter seed of human anger almost exclusively germinates when you foolishly attempt to control that uncontrollable external domain. You burn immense amounts of physical and emotional energy, desperately trying to force the chaotic world to perfectly match your own personal expectations. And when the world inevitably refuses to comply, you explode like a collapsing building. But the very second you apply the dichotomy of control, you experience an overwhelming, instantly liberating surge of immense relief. If you realize that the source of your anger is completely outside of your control, you must immediately categorize it as a useless external event and completely discard it from your mind. You simply accept that you cannot control the incredibly disrespectful coworker, but you can absolutely control your unbreakable refusal to let their pathetic behavior dictate your blood pressure, permanently securing your unshakable peace of mind forever. At this exact point in your psychological journey, you might be falling into the single biggest trap and most widespread misconception about this ancient philosophy, thinking that adopting this intense observer perspective and constantly filtering your daily reactions will inevitably turn you into a completely cold, heartless, and emotionless robot. You might mistakenly believe that permanently silencing your towering rage means you must completely paralyze your human spirit, passively accepting every single terrible thing the world throws at you without ever fighting back or standing up for your own personal boundaries. That is an absolute lie, and it completely misunderstands the true, unparalleled power of mental distancing. The brilliant Stoic philosophers did not want you to become indifferent or artificially suppress your natural feelings, because aggressively repressing your emotions is just building a highly dangerous psychological pressure cooker that will eventually explode and destroy your entire life. Instead, what they were actually teaching was the absolute peak of emotional intelligence. You are not killing your natural emotions. You are simply dethroning them so they no longer rule as violent, unpredictable tyrants over your mind. When you successfully master the ability to step back and observe your internal weather without being completely consumed by it, you unlock a massive plot twist about human psychology. Anger is not entirely useless if, and only if, you are the one firmly holding the leash. When you finally strip anger of its destructive, blinding madness, you can actually harvest its raw, deeply potent energy and actively transmute it into a highly focused, creative, and unstoppable force for monumental progress. Consider the profound historical example of Martin Luther King Jr., who faced unimaginable, deeply institutionalized racial injustice across the entire nation. He was understandably filled with an intense, incredibly deep rage regarding the horrific treatment of his people. But instead of allowing that anger to become a collapsing building that blindly destroyed everything around him, he expertly channeled that raw emotional fire into a highly disciplined, fiercely constructive, and entirely non-violent movement that permanently altered the course of human history. He essentially used mental distancing to actively prevent his justified anger from mutating into toxic hatred, transforming it instead into a brilliant instrument for immense social change. Or look at the legendary artist Pablo Picasso, who experienced overwhelming, visceral outrage after witnessing the horrific, devastating bombing of a small town that killed hundreds of innocent men, women, and children. He did not waste his precious energy violently screaming at the sky or uncontrollably lashing out at his neighbors in a temporary fit of blind rage. Instead, he immediately took that towering, burning fury, stepped into his art studio, and aggressively channeled every single ounce of his righteous anger into creating a massive, world-changing masterpiece painting in just 35 days. A monumental piece of art that art critics literally described as pure rage in oil. The crucial, life-changing difference between these extraordinary individuals and the deeply exhausted, chronically furious people you see screaming in the local grocery store or violently tailgating you on a crowded 10-lane interstate is entirely about who is actually in control. The reactive, unexamined mind is a pathetic slave to its own anger, recklessly burning down its own house just to feel a fleeting second of warmth and superiority. But the proactive, emotionally intelligent mind, the mind that has rigorously trained itself to step back, silently count the 24 letters of the ancient alphabet, and deeply invoke the observer's self, treats anger like a highly volatile, incredibly valuable rocket fuel. You do not let the dangerous fuel spill all over the floor and blindly toss a lit match at it, because that will only annihilate you and everyone you care about. Instead, you carefully contain it within the unbreakable titanium engine of your rational, logical mind, and you deliberately use its immense power to propel yourself forward, completely dominating your chaotic circumstances while maintaining an untouchable, fiercely guarded core of absolute inner peace. This is the ultimate, undeniable proof that mental distancing does not make you weak, compliant, or apathetic. It actually makes you overwhelmingly powerful, completely immune to the chaotic manipulation of the outside world, and fully capable of turning your darkest, most volatile emotions into your greatest, most triumphant victories. As you master this incredible ability to transmute your volatile emotions into highly productive rocket fuel, you will eventually reach the absolute pinnacle of mental distancing, a profound state of existence that ancient philosophers considered the ultimate freedom. This final, highest level of psychological evolution is the life-changing realization that true forgiveness and deep empathy are actually the ultimate power moves, completely severing the invisible strings that the chaotic world uses to manipulate your mind. The legendary Stoic philosopher Epictetus delivered what is arguably the most liberating truth in human history when he brilliantly stated that it is not things themselves that disturb people, but their deeply flawed judgments about those things. Think about what this actually means in your daily life. When someone relentlessly insults you or highly disrespects you, that person is fundamentally just expelling air from their lungs and making completely random, meaningless sounds with their mouth. And it is entirely your own brain that artificially translates those random sounds into a deeply offensive insult. It is your own highly insecure ego that actively decides to grant those mere words the devastating power to ruin your entire day, completely destroy your hard-earned tranquility, and spike your blood pressure. Epictetus fiercely reminded his students that it is never the person who directly injures you or aggressively verbally attacks you who actually insults you, but rather it is exclusively your own internal judgment that convinces you that you are being insulted. When you finally grasp this monumental truth, you unlock the ultimate superpower of profound empathy, which instantly transforms you from a highly reactive victim into a completely untouchable observer. When you look at an incredibly angry, toxic, and deeply disrespectful person who is desperately trying to drag you down into their miserable reality, you stop seeing them as a terrifying monster or a formidable enemy. Instead, you clearly see them for exactly what they are, which is a deeply suffering, emotionally exhausted human being who is completely enslaved by their own temporary madness and totally blinded by their own unexamined ego. They are acting out of pure, unadulterated ignorance, recklessly burning down their own internal house and desperately begging you to catch fire alongside them. By deeply understanding their profound psychological deficit, you effortlessly cultivate a towering sense of emotional intelligence that completely neutralizes their hostile intentions before they can ever reach you. When you actively choose empathy over explosive retaliation, you are not being weak. You are not passively surrendering your boundaries. And you are certainly not letting them win. You are actually executing the most dominant, emotionally intelligent maneuver possible, which is absolutely refusing to drink their toxic poison. You are deliberately choosing to unconditionally forgive them. Not because they necessarily deserve your forgiveness, but because you absolutely deserve your unshakable peace of mind. This brings us to the ultimate, uncompromising challenge for your daily life moving forward. The very next time you feel that highly familiar, intense heat rapidly rising in your chest, whether you are driving down a crowded interstate at 70 miles per hour and a reckless driver dangerously swerves into your lane, or you are sitting in a highly stressful corporate meeting and a jealous coworker brutally undermines your hard work in front of your boss, you must remember the 2,000-year-old secret. Do not blindly surrender to the biological impulse. Do not instantly become the furiously collapsing building that indiscriminately crushes everything in its path. Do not willingly hand over the precious keys to your mind to a total stranger. Instead, aggressively hit the psychological pause button. Force yourself to silently count the 24 letters of the ancient alphabet. Take a massive step back from the violent, swirling hurricane of your own immediate emotions and instantly activate the observer self. Stand firmly on that sunlit, untouchable mountain peak and calmly look down at the chaotic weather trying to desperately rage below you. Remember that you possess absolute, undeniable power over your own mind, not over the highly unpredictable, totally uncontrollable outside events. By deliberately choosing this powerful, proactive response, you permanently reclaim the supreme throne of your own consciousness, completely transforming every single daily frustration into a brilliant opportunity to practice your unbreakable composure and ultimately achieving the absolute pinnacle of human tranquility. Achieving this absolute pinnacle of human tranquility is not a one-time event, but rather it requires a rigorous, daily psychological training regimen to ensure that your invincible mental fortress is never breached by the chaotic, highly unpredictable modern world. You cannot simply wait for a massive, devastating emotional hurricane to violently strike your life before you suddenly decide to start practicing the ancient art of mental distancing. True masters of this profound philosophy actively prepare for the brutal storm while the sun is still shining brightly in the sky. To build this unbreakable emotional endurance, the ancient philosophers ruthlessly utilized a highly counterintuitive, incredibly powerful psychological weapon known as negative visualization. At first glance, our modern society might completely misinterpret this demanding practice as toxic pessimism, but it is actually the ultimate, bulletproof form of emotional insurance. Negative visualization fundamentally requires you to systematically and deliberately imagine the worst possible scenarios unfolding in your everyday life before they ever actually happen. When you wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning, before you even pour your first cup of coffee, you must consciously force your brain to picture the absolutely most frustrating things that could occur that day. You vividly imagine the catastrophic traffic jam on the 10-lane interstate that will make you incredibly late for work. You mentally visualize your most toxic coworker attempting to completely undermine your important project during the critical afternoon meeting, and you picture your expensive, brand new laptop slipping out of your hand and shattering into 100 pieces on the hard concrete floor. By intentionally exposing your mind to these deeply aggravating scenarios in the absolute safety of your own imagination, you systematically inoculate your fragile ego against the paralyzing shock of sudden adversity. When the inevitable disaster finally strikes in actual reality, you do not react like a helpless, panicking victim who has been caught entirely off guard, because you have already fought and decisively won that exact emotional battle inside your own mind. You simply smile, instantly activate the observer self, and realize that the chaotic event is exactly what you prepared for. The brilliant Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius actively practiced this extreme mental conditioning every single morning, explicitly reminding himself that he would inevitably encounter people who were deeply ungrateful, fiercely arrogant, totally dishonest, immensely jealous, and completely hostile. He did not let this profound realization make him cynical, bitter, or hateful towards humanity. Instead, He intelligently used it to completely neutralize the destructive power of surprise. He understood perfectly that human anger thrives almost exclusively on our deeply flawed, highly naive expectations that the outside world is always supposed to be fair, completely rational, and perfectly aligned with our own personal desires. When you actively destroy those deeply unrealistic expectations through the deliberate practice of negative visualization, you literally starve your explosive anger to death, because absolutely nothing can ever surprise you enough to hijack your nervous system. Furthermore, this intense morning preparation must be permanently coupled with a relentless evening routine of deep Stoic meditation and rigorous internal reflection. After battling the chaotic, deafening noise of the world all day long, you must sit down in complete silence and ruthlessly audit your own emotional reactions. You must ask yourself deeply uncomfortable, highly revealing questions about your daily performance. Did you successfully maintain your vast psychological buffer zone when the aggressive driver ruthlessly cut you off? Or did you temporarily surrender your power and let the biological impulse completely take control of your steering wheel? Did you accurately apply the strict dichotomy of control? Or did you foolishly waste your precious physical and mental energy demanding that the uncontrollable universe immediately bend to your will? This specific meditative practice is absolutely not a session for crippling guilt or useless self-pity. Rather, it is a clinical, highly objective review of your psychological battlefield tactics. By relentlessly interrogating your own daily actions with brutal honesty, you aggressively expose the hidden weaknesses in your emotional armor and absolutely guarantee that you will perform significantly better tomorrow. Through this continuous loop of morning visualization and evening reflection, you permanently transition from being a reactive, emotionally exhausted participant in the chaotic drama of daily life to becoming the calm, untouchable architect of your own unshakable reality. This daily discipline physically and permanently rewires your brain, transforming mental distancing from a conscious, highly difficult effort into an automatic, impenetrable state of being where true peak calmness simply becomes who you fundamentally are, forever beyond the reach of the raging storms below. As you successfully rewire your brain through these rigorous daily exercises and continuous internal reflections, something truly extraordinary begins to happen to your entire experience of human existence. You no longer walk out of your front door every morning feeling like a fragile, highly vulnerable target, just waiting to be inevitably struck by the chaotic arrows of the outside world. Instead, you step into the world completely cloaked in an invisible, impenetrable armor of profound emotional intelligence. This is the absolute essence of what it means to finally achieve that highly coveted state of peak calmness. It is absolutely essential to recognize that mastering this profound 2,000-year-old technique of mental distancing does not mean that your daily life will suddenly become perfectly easy, completely fair, or entirely devoid of extremely frustrating situations. The crowded 10-lane interstates will still be hopelessly gridlocked with aggressive, reckless drivers commanding massive 3-ton trucks who will dangerously cut you off at 80 miles per hour without ever bothering to use their turn signals. The modern corporate offices will still be heavily populated with deeply insecure, highly toxic coworkers who will desperately attempt to undermine your hard work just to temporarily massage their own dangerously fragile egos. The unpredictable universe will continuously and relentlessly try to pull your invisible strings, desperately demanding that you blindly dance to its chaotic, deeply exhausting rhythm. However, the monumental, life-changing difference is that these external forces completely lose all of their destructive power over you because you absolutely refuse to surrender your strings. When you finally stop letting your unexamined, disguised pride dictate your immediate biological reactions, you permanently stop being the collapsing building that Seneca so brilliantly described, the one that tragically destroys its own foundation just to momentarily punish the ground it falls upon. Instead, you permanently transition into the towering, untouchable mountain that simply allows the violent, temporary weather to pass harmlessly over its ancient peaks. The great Stoic philosophers understood perfectly well that human anger, in its raw, unfiltered biological form, is almost never a righteous crusade for justice, but rather nothing more than a pathetic, humiliating confession of internal weakness. It is a desperate, screaming admission that you have completely lost control over your own internal kingdom and voluntarily allowed a total stranger to comfortably sit on the precious throne of your own mind. But when you actively invoke the observer self, deliberately create that massive, life-saving psychological buffer zone by silently counting the 24 letters of the ancient alphabet, and ruthlessly apply the strict dichotomy of control to every single daily frustration, you forcefully and permanently reclaim that royal throne. You instantly realize that true, unshakable strength is never loud. It is never aggressively reactive, and it absolutely never needs to constantly prove its dominance by violently lashing out at every single perceived insult. True strength is incredibly quiet. It is the profound, deeply intimidating silence of a rational mind that is so totally secure in its own internal sovereignty that absolutely nothing in the external domain can ever disturb its deep, still waters. This is the ultimate, incredibly liberating truth that this ancient philosophy offers to our deeply exhausted, chronically outraged modern society. You have the absolute, undeniable power to choose exactly how you will experience your life. Regardless of what the highly unpredictable, totally uncontrollable world throws at you today, tomorrow, or 10 years from now, you absolutely do not have to be a helpless, panicking victim of your own volatile internal chemistry. You do not have to spend the rest of your precious life desperately drinking toxic poison while foolishly hoping that your enemies will somehow suffer the fatal consequences. You can actively choose to unconditionally forgive the profoundly ignorant people who try to drag you down into their miserable reality, not because you are weak or submissive, but because your unshakable peace of mind is vastly more valuable than their petty, utterly meaningless drama. So the very next time you feel that highly familiar, intense fire rapidly spreading through your chest, and your deeply bruised ego desperately screams at you to immediately explode and retaliate, you must remember the profound, timeless wisdom of Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca. Take a massive, deliberate step back from the blinding heat of the moment. Become the silent, untouchable observer standing safely on the highest sunlit peak. Look directly at the raging storm of your own passing emotions and firmly declare that it has absolutely zero authority over your rational mind. By doing this consistently, you will not only conquer your own destructive anger and permanently cure the psychological illness of projection bias, but you will permanently unlock the ultimate human superpower, completely mastering the beautiful, unshakable art of mental distancing and living the rest of your life in absolute, triumphant freedom. The ancient technique of mental distancing is your ultimate psychological weapon against a deeply chaotic world that constantly tries to steal your peace. Stop being a helpless puppet to your fragile ego and start acting like the untouchable mountain. You have the absolute power to reclaim the royal throne of your mind right now. If this brutal truth finally woke you up and you are ready to master your internal weather, smash that subscribe button immediately. Like this video. Share it with someone who desperately needs this wake-up call, and never let anyone pull your strings again. See you next video.